The move to the new house was supposed to be a fresh start for us, a chance to leave behind the memories of the past and build a new life together. The neighborhood seemed idyllic, with its tree-lined streets and neatly manicured lawns, and the house itself was charming, with its white picket fence and cheerful red door. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were friendly, waving to us as we unpacked our boxes and settled into our new home. My daughter was thrilled to have her own room, and I was relieved to finally have a place to call our own. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. It started with small things, objects misplaced, strange noises in the middle of the night, but soon escalated into something much more sinister. I would wake up in the morning to find the furniture rearranged, or the windows open when I was sure I had closed them the night before. My daughter started complaining of nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night screaming about a man with dark eyes watching her from the shadows. At first, I tried to dismiss it as her imagination running wild, but as the occurrences became more frequent, I began to suspect that something was seriously wrong. I confided in a few of the neighbors, hoping they could shed some light on what was happening, but they just smiled and reassured me that everything was fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the neighborhood, the way the neighbors seemed to watch us with a strange intensity, the way the air seemed to crackle with an undercurrent of tension whenever we walked down the street. One night, as I was tucking my daughter into bed, she whispered something that sent chills down my spine. She said she had seen the man with dark eyes standing outside her window, watching her as she slept. I tried to reassure her that it was just a bad dream, but deep down, I knew there was something more to her story. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that there was someone out there lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the weeks passed, the strange occurrences only seemed to escalate. I would hear footsteps in the hallway at night, or catch glimpses of shadowy figures moving just beyond the edge of my vision. I tried to rationalize it away, telling myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew there was something more sinister at play. One night, as I was lying awake in bed, I heard the sound of footsteps outside my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened to the sound of someone moving through the bushes outside. I wanted to call out for help, but fear had rendered me speechless, my voice trapped in my throat. I lay there in the darkness, paralyzed with fear, as the footsteps grew closer and closer. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped, leaving me alone in the silence of the night. The next morning, I went to the police, hoping they could help me make sense of what was happening. But when I told them about the strange occurrences in the neighborhood, they just looked at me with pitying eyes, as if they thought I was crazy. Frustrated and desperate for answers, I turned to the only person I thought might be able to help me, the neighbor who lived next door. I knocked on his door, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for him to answer. The neighbor opened the door, his expression neutral but with a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Hey," I began, my voice shaky as I struggled to find the right words. I've been noticing some weird things happening in the neighborhood lately, and I was wondering if you've experienced anything strange too." The neighbor raised an eyebrow, his lips quirking into a half smile. "Weird things? Like what?" I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest as I forced the words out. "Well, it's hard to explain, but strange noises at night, things going missing, that sort of thing. And my daughter keeps saying she feels like someone's watching her." The neighbor's smile faltered slightly, his eyes flicking away for a moment before returning to mine. "Ha, that does sound unsettling," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "But I haven't noticed anything like that myself." I felt a knot form in my stomach, a sinking feeling of dread washing over me as I realized that I was alone in this. If even the neighbor hadn't experienced anything strange, then maybe I really was just imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something lurking in the shadows, something sinister and unseen that was watching our every move. As I turned to leave, the neighbor cleared his throat, his voice low and hesitant. "You know, there was something strange that happened a while back. I don't know if it's related, but, well, there was this guy who used to live in your house before you moved in. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I turned back to face him. What guy? Who was he? The neighbor shrugged, a troubled look in his eyes. I don't know much about him, to be honest. He kept to himself mostly, but there were rumors, whispers about strange noises coming from the house late at night, strange visitors coming and going at odd hours. My stomach churned at the mention of strange visitors, my mind racing with possibilities. Could it be possible that whoever had lived in our house before us was somehow connected to the strange occurrences we'd been experiencing? But before I could ask any more questions, the neighbor shook his head, a nervous smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Anyway, like I said, it's probably nothing. Just thought you should know. I nodded numbly, my mind spinning with a million questions and no answers in sight. We decided to leave the house and put it up for sale later that week and ended up buying a new house in a new town. We have been here for 2 years now with no issues. But every time I think back on that house, it gives me the creeps. Moving to a new town was exciting at first. My husband and I had decided to start fresh, leaving behind the hustle and bustle of the city for a quieter life in the suburbs. I threw myself into settling in, attending local events and meeting new people. My husband didn't, he worked remotely so he would always be in the home office. But me, I made friends quickly, finding a sense of belonging in this close-knit community. Everything seemed perfect until I met him. He was charming and confident, and I found myself drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. We started spending more time together, meeting for coffee or going for walks in the park. I told myself it was harmless, just a friendship, but deep down, I knew there was something more between us. One night, after a few drinks at a local bar, we kissed. It was electric, sending shivers down my spine as I realized how much I had missed the thrill of new love. We would see each other when we could, and I would always spend time at his house. But as time went on, guilt gnawed at me, reminding me of the vows I had made to my husband. I tried to push him away, to distance myself from the temptation of his touch. But he was persistent, showing up unannounced at my doorstep and sending me messages late into the night. I knew I had to end things before they went any further. I loved my husband, despite our problems, and I couldn't bear the thought of betraying him any further. When I told him it was over, he didn't take it well. He begged me to reconsider, pleading with me to give him another chance. But I stood firm, determined to honor my commitment to my husband no matter what. That's when things started to get strange. I would hear footsteps outside my window late at night, or catch glimpses of a figure lurking in the shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid after the affair. But then I started receiving strange messages, cryptic and threatening, warning me to stay away from him. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself they were just a prank, but they kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. I confided in my husband, hoping he would protect me from whatever was lurking in the darkness. But instead of comforting me, he accused me of lying, of making up stories to cover my guilt. He left me and went to stay with his sister back in our hometown. I felt alone and vulnerable, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. I tried to go about my daily life as if nothing was wrong, but the fear gnawed at me, eating away at my sanity. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sound of someone moving through the house. My heart raced as I listened to the creak of floorboards and the rustle of fabric. I wanted to scream for help, but fear paralyzed me, rendering me powerless to do anything but lie there and wait for the intruder to reveal themselves. When morning came, I found the front door unlocked and the windows open, as if someone had been searching for something in the darkness of the night. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that I was being paranoid after the affair, but deep down, I knew there was something more sinister at play. I started spending more time away from home, avoiding the places where I felt the most vulnerable. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. I confided in a friend on FaceTime that I made in the new town, Jasmine. She worked in the local baker's. Hoping for some reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind, I told her what was happening. But instead of comfort, she offered me a warning, her eyes wide with fear as she spoke of the rumors that had been circulating in town. According to the whispers, there was a man who had been stalking women in the area, watching them from a distance and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened to her words, realizing that I was being targeted by someone who meant me harm. My husband was not even answering my calls, and I felt so alone. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. I wanted to run, to escape from the darkness that had engulfed my life, but I knew there was nowhere to hide. In the end, I was forced to confront him myself, to stand up to the monster who had been terrorizing me for so long. From then on, he backed off, but I still didn't feel safe. My husband got in contact about selling the house in a divorce, and once the house sold, I moved out into a new town for a fresh start. I have been here for the best part of a year now and have met a new guy called Andy, been with him 4 months. Life is looking good, but looking back on that time of my life sends chills down my spine. The move to our new cottage in the countryside was supposed to be the start of our happily ever after. The place looked straight out of a fairy tale with its quaint exterior and lush surroundings. We were excited to begin our life together in such a picturesque setting. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors welcomed us warmly, offering baked goods and friendly smiles. But as we settled in, we started noticing strange things. One evening, as I was unpacking boxes in the attic, I found a stack of old newspapers hidden beneath a floorboard. The headlines were unsettling, filled with stories of disappearances and unsolved mysteries in the village. I brushed it off as sensationalism, but it planted a seed of unease in my mind. As we got to know our neighbors better, we realized there was an air of secrecy surrounding them. They were polite enough, but there was something off about their smiles, something insincere in their greetings. One neighbor in particular, Mr. Jenkins, gave me the creeps. He had a permanent leer on his face, and his eyes seemed to follow us wherever we went. Whenever we crossed paths, he would nod in greeting, but his gaze lingered a little too long, sending shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore my growing unease, chalking it up to nerves and unfamiliar surroundings. But then strange things started happening around the cottage. One night, we heard footsteps outside our bedroom window. When I went to investigate, I found muddy footprints leading away from the house, disappearing into the darkness. I told myself it was just a wandering animal, but deep down, I knew it was something more sinister. The incidents became more frequent as time went on. Objects would go missing, only to turn up in strange places days later. We would hear whispers in the dead of night, faint voices carrying on the wind. I confided in my husband, but he brushed off my concerns, insisting it was just my imagination running wild. He didn't want to entertain the idea that something was wrong, preferring to believe we were safe in our new home. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over me like a dark cloud. I started avoiding our neighbors, avoiding eye contact and making excuses to stay indoors. I didn't trust them, didn't want to be around them any longer than necessary. Then one day, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. I was rummaging through a box in the garage when I found a stack of old photographs hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. They were faded and yellowed with age, but as I flipped through them, I felt a chill grip my heart. The photographs were of our neighbors, but they weren't smiling and waving like they had been when we first met. They were standing in a circle, their faces twisted with malice as they stared into the camera with cold, dead eyes. I showed the photographs to my husband, hoping he would finally take me seriously. But instead of being concerned, he laughed it off, dismissing the photographs as a prank or a misunderstanding. I knew then that I was on my own. I couldn't rely on my husband to protect me, couldn't trust anyone in this village to have my back. I had to find out the truth on my own, no matter the cost. I started doing some digging, asking around town and doing research online. The more I uncovered, the more terrified I became. It turned out that our neighbors had a dark secret, one that had been buried for years beneath the facade of small-town charm. They were part of a cult, a group of people who believed in dark rituals and ancient gods. I couldn't believe it at first, couldn't wrap my head around the idea that the people living next door were capable of such evil. But the evidence was undeniable, and I knew I had to get out before it was too late. I tried to convince my husband to leave, but he refused to listen, insisting that I was overreacting and letting my imagination run wild. He didn't want to believe that the people we had trusted were capable of such horrors. In the end, I had no choice but to leave him behind and escape on my own. I packed a bag and slipped out in the dead of night, leaving behind everything I had ever known in search of safety. I'd retired from the force after years of chasing down criminals and solving cases. It was time for a change, time to take on a new challenge. So, I decided to buy a historic mansion that had been on the market for ages. Renovating it sounded like the perfect project to keep me occupied in my retirement. The mansion had an eerie charm to it, with its grand architecture and sprawling grounds. As I delved into the renovation process, I started uncovering bits and pieces of its history. One day, while tearing down a wall in the basement, I stumbled upon a hidden room. It was small and windowless, with rusty chains bolted to the walls. My blood ran cold as I realized that this room must have been used for something sinister in the past. I brushed it off as a relic of a bygone era, but the discovery left me feeling unsettled. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something dark lurking beneath the surface of this grand mansion. As I continued with the renovations, I started finding more clues about the house's dark past. Old newspaper clippings hinted at a series of unsolved murders that had taken place in the area decades ago. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that the mansion may have been connected to these crimes. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon a hidden compartment in the attic that I uncovered the full extent of the house's dark history. Inside, I found a collection of journals written by a past owner of the mansion. As I read through the entries, my stomach turned with disgust. They detailed in chilling detail the atrocities that had been committed within these walls. The past owner had been a sadistic serial killer, luring victims to the mansion and torturing them in the hidden room in the basement. I felt sick to my stomach as I read about the horrors that had taken place right under my nose. I couldn't believe that I had unknowingly purchased a house with such a dark past. But as I delved deeper into the journals, I realized that the past owner had never been caught. The murders had been covered up, the evidence buried along with the victims' bodies. The detective in me wanted to report it, but the retired me who just wanted a peaceful life decided not to. I tried to put the journals out of my mind, to focus on finishing the renovations and moving on with my life. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that hung over the mansion like a shadow. One night, as I was lying in bed, my brain was fixed on the murders like I was working another case. I couldn't sleep at all that night. When morning came, I searched the house from top to bottom, then I found something that made my blood run cold. Tucked away in a corner of the basement, hidden beneath a pile of old blankets, was a collection of photographs. They were old and faded, but as I looked closer, I realized they were pictures of the past owner of a mansion. In each one, he wore a twisted grin as he posed with his victims, their lifeless eyes staring back at me from the faded photographs. I knew then that I had to get out of the mansion, to leave behind the darkness that had consumed it for so long. After my wife passed away, I couldn't bear to stay in our old house. Every corner was filled with memories of her, and the silence felt suffocating. So, I downsized to a cozy suburban bungalow, hoping to find some peace and a fresh start. The new place was quaint and comforting, with its warm wooden floors and sunlit rooms. I spent my days sorting through my wife's belongings, trying to come to terms with her absence. But as the nights grew longer, I started to feel a creeping sense of unease. It started with the phone calls. Late at night, when I was alone in the darkness, the phone would ring, echoing through the empty house like a gunshot. I would pick up, only to be met with silence on the other end of the line. At first, I brushed it off as a wrong number or a prank call. But as the calls continued night after night, I started to feel like I was being watched, like someone was trying to reach out to me from beyond the grave. I tried to ignore the calls, to convince myself that they were just a figment of my imagination. But they kept coming, each one more chilling than the last. Then, one night, I answered the phone to hear a voice on the other end. It was a woman's voice, soft and gentle, but tinged with sadness. She called me Jamie and asked me why I had stopped calling her. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that the calls were meant for the previous tenant, Jamie. But the woman on the other end seemed convinced that I was him, that I had been avoiding her for some reason. I tried to explain that I wasn't Jamie, that I had just moved into the bungalow after his departure. But the woman didn't seem to believe me, her voice growing more frantic with each passing moment. I hung up the phone, shaking with fear as I realized that something was seriously wrong. Who was this woman, and why was she calling me in the middle of the night? I tried to put the calls out of my mind, to focus on moving forward with my life. But the woman's voice haunted me, echoing through the empty rooms of the bungalow like a ghost. Then, one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. My heart raced as I listened to the creak of floorboards and the rustle of fabric. I wanted to call out for help, but fear paralyzed me, rendering me powerless to do anything but lie there and wait for the intruder to reveal themselves. When morning came, I searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of anyone else being there. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, a trick of the mind brought on by the stress of my wife's death. But then the calls started again, each one more urgent than the last. The woman begged me to come back to her, to return to the life we had shared together. But I didn't know her, didn't understand how she could be so convinced that I was someone else. I tried to block the calls, to shut out the woman's voice once and for all. But no matter what I did, she always found a way to reach me, her words echoing in my ears like a curse. I started avoiding the phone altogether, letting it ring unanswered as I hid in the darkness of my bungalow. But even then, I couldn't escape the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I tried to reach out for help, to tell someone about the calls and the footsteps in the night. But no one believed me, dismissing my fears as the product of grief and loneliness. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. And as the calls grew more frequent and more desperate, I decided to disconnect the line. My son came to visit after not hearing from me and got me one of them cell phones. After that, I was still able to contact family and friends without being spooked out by them calls. My son done some digging and got in contact with Jamie, and he said he had similar calls for a man called Andrew. He kept telling the lady he was Jamie, not Andrew, but she wouldn't believe him. All of it got a bit strange for me in dealing with a loss. I didn't need all of that. Moving into the retirement community was supposed to be a fresh start for us. After years of living in our old house, we thought it was time to downsize and enjoy our golden years surrounded by people our own age. The community seemed nice enough, with its neat rows of bungalows and well-kept gardens. But as we settled in, we started to notice that something was off. People were friendly enough, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. Whenever we tried to strike up a conversation with our neighbors, they would quickly change the subject or make excuses to leave. At first, we brushed it off as just the way things were in a new place. But as the weeks went by and we still hadn't made any friends, we started to wonder if there was something more going on. One day, while out for a walk around the community, we stumbled upon a group of people gathered around a notice board. They were talking in hushed tones, casting nervous glances over their shoulders as if afraid of being overheard. Curious, we approached to see what all the fuss was about. That's when we saw the flyers plastered all over the notice board, warning residents to be cautious around the community security officers. The flyers described a string of incidents where the security officers had overstepped their bounds, harassing residents and even confiscating personal belongings without cause. There were rumors of them conducting illegal searches of people's homes and using excessive force against anyone who dared to question their authority. We were shocked and horrified by what we read. We had moved into the retirement community hoping for a peaceful and safe place to spend our twilight years, but it seemed like we had stumbled into a nightmare instead. We tried to talk to our neighbors about what we had seen, but they just shook their heads and whispered about how dangerous it was to speak out against the security officers. They warned us to keep our heads down and stay out of trouble if we knew what was good for us. But we couldn't just sit back and do nothing. We had always believed in standing up for what was right, no matter the consequences. So, we decided to investigate further, determined to uncover the truth behind the rumors that were swirling around the retirement community. We started asking questions, talking to anyone who would listen about their experiences with the security officers. What we heard was chilling. People spoke of being stopped and searched for no reason, of having their personal belongings confiscated without explanation. But the most disturbing stories were the ones about the disappearances. There were rumors that people who had spoken out against the security officers had vanished without a trace, their homes left empty and their belongings confiscated by the authorities. We knew then that we were dealing with something far more sinister than just a few overzealous security officers. There was a darkness lurking beneath the surface of the retirement community, a darkness that threatened to swallow us whole if we weren't careful. But we couldn't just turn a blind eye and pretend like everything was fine. We had to do something, had to shine a light on the corruption and injustice that was happening right under our noses. So, we started gathering evidence, documenting everything we saw and heard. We took photographs and recorded conversations, determined to build a case against the security officers and bring them to justice. But as we delved deeper into the heart of the retirement community, we realized that we were in far over our heads. The security officers were everywhere, watching our every move with cold, calculating eyes. We started receiving threats, anonymous letters warning us to stop poking around if we knew what was good for us. But we refused to be intimidated, refused to back down in the face of injustice. Then, one night, as we were sitting in our bungalow, we heard a knock at the door. My heart raced as I approached cautiously, wondering who could be calling at this hour. When I opened the door, I was met with the sight of two security officers standing on the doorstep, their faces set in grim lines. They demanded to come inside, claiming they had received reports of illegal activity taking place in our home. I tried to protest, to tell them that they had no right to search our home without a warrant. But they just pushed past me, barging into our bungalow with a sense of entitlement that made my blood boil. They tore through our belongings, tossing aside everything in their path as they searched for evidence of wrongdoing. But when they found nothing, they just sneered at us and told us to keep our noses out of other people's business if we knew what was good for us. As they left, I felt a sense of defeat wash over me. We had tried to do the right thing, had tried to stand up for justice in the face of corruption. But it seemed like the forces working against us were too powerful to overcome. In the end, we had no choice but to leave the retirement community behind, to retreat to the safety of daughter's home and hope that one day, someone would come along who was brave enough to take up the fight where we left off. Moving to the desert town was supposed to be our fresh start. My wife and I were desperate to escape her ex-boyfriend, who had been stalking us for months. We didn't have much money, but we found a rundown shack on the outskirts of town that we could afford. Little did we know the horrors that awaited us. The first thing we noticed about the town was how isolated it was. There were only a handful of houses scattered across the desert, and the nearest town was miles away. But we didn't let that deter us. We were determined to make a new life for ourselves, far away from the prying eyes of my wife's ex. As we settled into our new home, we couldn't help but notice how unwelcoming the townsfolk were. They would stare at us as we walked down the street, their eyes filled with suspicion and mistrust. It was like they knew something we didn't, like they were hiding a dark secret. We tried to make friends with our neighbors, but they all seemed to be related in some way. It was like they were one big family, and we were outsiders intruding on their territory. They would give us curt nods and terse greetings before hurrying away, leaving us feeling even more isolated than before. Then, one day, we stumbled upon a shocking discovery. We were exploring the outskirts of town when we came across an old cemetery hidden in the desert. As we wandered among the crumbling headstones, we noticed something odd. Many of the graves had the same last name. It was then that we realized the horrifying truth. The residents of the town had been interbreeding for generations, creating a closed-off community with a dark and twisted history. We were sickened by the thought of it, but we couldn't deny the evidence right in front of us. As we delved deeper into the town's history, we uncovered even more disturbing secrets. There were rumors of incest, abuse, and even murder, all swept under the rug by the tight-knit community. It was like something out of a nightmare, a twisted reality that we couldn't escape from. But the worst was yet to come. As we tried to settle into our new life, the townsfolk grew increasingly hostile towards us. They would glare at us as we passed by, muttering under their breaths and casting dark looks in our direction. We tried to ignore their hostility, to carry on with our lives as if nothing was wrong. But it soon became clear that they had no intention of letting us live in peace. They would vandalize our property, leave threatening messages on our doorstep, and even follow us when we ventured into town. It was like they were trying to drive us out, to force us to leave their twisted little community and never come back. And as the threats grew more and more sinister, we realized that we had no choice but to leave. We packed our bags and fled the town under the cover of night, leaving behind the shack and all the nightmares it contained. As we drove away, we couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, like we had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. But even as we left the desert town behind, we knew that its dark secrets would haunt us forever. We had seen the true face of evil, and it was something that we would never be able to forget. Moving into the duplex was a big step for me. I was excited to have a place of my own, a quiet space where I could unwind after a long day at work. The neighborhood seemed nice enough, with its tree-lined streets and well-kept lawns. But as I settled into my new home, I started noticing strange things happening in the adjoining unit. At first, it was just little things, strange noises coming from the walls, lights flickering on and off at odd hours. I tried to brush it off as just the quirks of an old building, but the feeling of unease lingered. Then, one night, I heard the sound of someone moving around in the other unit. It was late, well past midnight, and I couldn't imagine why anyone would be up and about at that hour. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the noise persisted, growing louder and more urgent with each passing moment. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I crept over to the door that connected our units and pressed my ear against it, listening intently for any clue as to what was happening on the other side. That's when I heard it, the sound of someone whispering in hushed tones, their voice tinged with fear and desperation. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone sent a chill down my spine. I debated whether to knock on the door and see if everything was okay, but something held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about my neighbor, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The next morning, I decided to do some digging into my neighbor's background, hoping to uncover some clue as to what was going on. But the more I searched, the less I found. It was like they didn't even exist, like they had just appeared out of thin air. I tried to talk to other neighbors about what I had heard, but they just shrugged it off and told me not to worry about it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, that my neighbor was hiding something sinister behind closed doors. Then, one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard the sound of footsteps in the other unit. They were slow and deliberate, moving with purpose through the darkness. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. That's when I heard the sound of a door opening, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone crying out in pain. My blood ran cold as I realized that my neighbor was in trouble, that they needed help, and I was the only one who could do something about it. I debated whether to call the police, but something held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than met the eye, that involving the authorities would only make things worse. So, I made the decision to confront my neighbor myself. I knocked on their door, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for them to answer. When they finally opened the door, their face was pale and drawn, their eyes wide with fear. I asked them if everything was okay, if there was anything I could do to help. But they just shook their head and told me to mind my own business, slamming the door in my face before I could say another word. I knew then that I had to do something, that I couldn't just sit back and do nothing while my neighbor suffered in silence. So, I started keeping a close eye on their comings and goings, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was really going on behind closed doors. What I saw chilled me to the bone. I watched as my neighbor came and went at odd hours of the night, always looking over their shoulder as if afraid of being followed. I watched as they carried strange packages into their unit, packages that I suspected held something far more sinister than just groceries or household items. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that my neighbor knew I was onto them and was biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I tried to reach out for help, to tell someone about what I had seen and heard. But no one believed me, dismissing my fears as the product of an overactive imagination. In the end, I was left to face my neighbor alone, but just when I thought I was at my wit's end, a breakthrough came. One evening, as I was returning home from work, I noticed a commotion outside my neighbor's unit. Police cars were parked in front of the duplex, and officers were rushing in and out with a sense of urgency. I approached one of the officers and asked what was going on. He hesitated for a moment before telling me that they had received a tip about suspicious activity in the area and were conducting a search of the premises. My heart raced as I realized that this could be my chance to finally uncover the truth about my neighbor. I followed the officers into the duplex, my pulse quickening with each step. As they searched the unit next to mine, I waited anxiously for any sign of what they might find. And then, I heard the sound of someone shouting, followed by the unmistakable clink of handcuffs being snapped shut. I watched in disbelief as my neighbor was led out of the duplex in handcuffs, their face contorted with rage and fear. It turned out that they had been running a drug operation out of their unit, using the cover of the retirement community to avoid suspicion. As the truth came to light, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The mystery that had been plaguing me for weeks was finally solved, and I could rest easy knowing that my neighbor was no longer a threat to me or anyone else in the neighborhood. In the days that followed, life returned to normal in the duplex. The tension that had hung in the air like a dark cloud lifted, and I was able to settle into my new home without fear or suspicion. But the experience had changed me. I had seen firsthand the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the seemingly normal world, and I knew that I could never look at my neighbors in quite the same way again. As I sat on my porch one evening, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the police officers who had intervened and brought an end to the nightmare that had been unfolding next door. Moving into the suburban townhouse was supposed to be my chance at a fresh start. After everything that had happened, I needed to leave the past behind and start over in a new place. The townhouse seemed perfect, quiet, unassuming, a place where I could rebuild my life without anyone asking questions. But from the moment I moved in, I could feel something was off. It started with little things, objects misplaced, strange noises in the middle of the night, but soon escalated into something much more sinister. I would wake up in the morning to find things out of place, or hear footsteps in the hallway when I knew I was alone. At first, I tried to dismiss it as just my imagination, but deep down, I knew there was something more going on. Then, one night, I heard a knock on the door. It was late, well past midnight, and I couldn't imagine who would be calling at that hour. I hesitated before answering, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the door. When I opened it, there was no one there. I looked around, but the street was deserted, and there was no sign of anyone nearby. I told myself it was just a prank, that there was nothing to worry about, but the feeling of unease lingered. As the days passed, the strange occurrences only seemed to escalate. I would hear voices whispering in the darkness, or catch glimpses of shadowy figures moving just beyond the edge of my vision. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew there was something more sinister at play. It was like I was being haunted by my past, like the crime I had committed was coming back to haunt me. I tried to keep a low profile, to blend in with the other residents of the townhouse complex, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, one day, I received a letter in the mail. It was addressed to me, but there was no return address, no indication of who had sent it. I hesitated before opening it, a sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. Inside, there was just one word written in bold letters: remember. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the word, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that there was no way anyone could know about the crime I had committed, but deep down, I knew the truth. Someone was taunting me, someone who knew my darkest secrets and was using them against me. I tried to reach out for help, to tell someone about what was happening, but no one would listen. They just looked at me with pitying eyes, as if they thought I was crazy. In the end, I was left to face my demons alone, to confront the darkness that lurked within me. And as I stood on the doorstep of the townhouse, I realized that some secrets are best left buried, that trying to outrun your past only leads to more pain and suffering. But just when I thought I was at the end of my rope, a breakthrough came. One evening, as I was going through some old boxes in the attic, I stumbled upon a clue that shed light on the mystery that had been plaguing me. It was a newspaper clipping, dated from several years ago. The headline read, "Local nurse suspected in patient's death." My heart stopped as I read the article, my worst fears confirmed in black and white. I had thought I had gotten away with it, had thought I could start over and leave the past behind. But now, it seemed like my past was catching up with me, like the crime I had committed was coming back to haunt me in the worst possible way. I knew then that I had to do something, that I couldn't just sit back and let someone else control my fate. So, I made the decision to confront my past head-on, to confess to the crime I had committed and face the consequences of my actions. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the right thing to do. And as I stood in front of the police station, ready to turn myself in, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I may have committed a terrible crime, but I was determined to make amends, to take responsibility for my actions and do whatever it took to make things right. And as I walked through the doors of the police station, I knew that, no matter what happened next, I was finally free from the grip of my past. Moving into the modern subdivision was supposed to be our fresh start. We were hopeful, eager to leave behind the troubles of the past and build a better life for our family. The neighborhood seemed perfect, quiet, safe, with well-manicured lawns and friendly neighbors. But as we settled into our new home, things started to feel off. It started with little things, strange noises in the middle of the night, objects misplaced, a feeling of unease that lingered in the air. At first, we tried to brush it off as just the quirks of a new place, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger with each passing day. It was like there was something lurking just beneath the surface, something dark and sinister that we couldn't quite put our finger on. Then, one day, my husband stumbled upon something that sent chills down our spines. He was doing some yard work when he unearthed a box buried in the backyard. Inside, he found a series of old newspaper clippings detailing a string of unsolved disappearances in the area. We couldn't believe what we were reading. It seemed like there was a dark history hidden within the community, a history that no one wanted to talk about. We tried to ask our neighbors about it, but they just shrugged it off and told us not to worry. But we couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, that there was more to the story than met the eye. We started doing some digging of our own, trying to uncover the truth behind the disappearances. What we found was even more disturbing than we could have imagined. It seemed like there was a pattern to the disappearances, a pattern that pointed to someone within the community being responsible. We tried to warn our neighbors, to tell them what we had discovered, but no one would listen. They just looked at us like we were crazy, like we were making up stories to cause trouble. As the days passed, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. We started noticing strange behavior from our neighbors, furtive glances, whispered conversations, a sense of paranoia that hung in the air like a thick fog. Then, one night, we heard the sound of someone digging in the backyard. We looked out the window to see our neighbor, Mr. Johnson, digging a hole in the middle of the night. We watched in horror as he buried something in the ground before covering it up and returning to his house. We knew then that we had to do something, that we couldn't just sit back and do nothing while our neighbors carried out whatever dark deeds they were planning. So, we decided to go to the police, to tell them everything we had discovered and let them handle it. But when we arrived at the police station, we were met with disbelief and skepticism. The officers listened to our story, but they didn't seem convinced. They told us they would look into it, but we could tell they didn't take us seriously. Feeling defeated, we returned home, unsure of what to do next. We knew we couldn't trust our neighbors, but we also couldn't rely on the police to help us. We were on our own, trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Then, one night, as we were lying in bed, we heard a knock on the door. It was late, well past midnight, and we couldn't imagine who would be calling at that hour. My husband hesitated before answering, his hand shaking as he reached for the doorknob. When he opened the door, there was no one there. We looked around, but the street was deserted, and there was no sign of anyone nearby. We tried to tell ourselves it was just a prank, but deep down, we knew it was something far more sinister. As we lay in bed, listening to the sound of our own hearts pounding in our chests, we knew that our nightmare was far from over. We were trapped in a community filled with dark secrets, secrets that threatened to consume us whole. And as we huddled together in the darkness, we realized that the only way to escape was to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. We were determined to uncover the secrets hidden within the subdivision, no matter the cost. Days turned into weeks as we delved deeper into the mysteries of the subdivision. We uncovered more clues, piecing together a dark and twisted history that had been buried beneath the surface for years. We discovered that the disappearances were not random, but orchestrated by a group of influential residents who were involved in illegal activities. They had been using the subdivision as a cover for their nefarious deeds, preying on unsuspecting victims who stumbled into their web of deceit. As we gathered evidence, we knew we were putting ourselves in danger. The residents of the subdivision were not happy about us poking around, and we could feel their eyes watching us wherever we went. But we refused to back down. We were determined to bring the truth to light, to expose the darkness that lurked within the community and put an end to the horrors that had been plaguing it for far too long. Finally, after weeks of investigation, we had gathered enough evidence to take to the authorities. We presented our findings to the police, laying out the evidence of the crimes that had been committed within the subdivision. This time, the police took us seriously. They launched an investigation into the allegations, arresting several of the residents who had been involved in the illegal activities. With the perpetrators behind bars, we finally felt a sense of relief. The nightmare that had haunted us for so long was finally over, and we could begin to rebuild our lives without fear of what lurked in the shadows. We decided to leave the subdivision behind, eager to put the dark chapter of our lives behind us. As we packed up our belongings and said goodbye to the neighborhood, we felt a sense of closure wash over us. But even as we drove away, we couldn't shake the feeling that the horrors we had witnessed would stay with us forever. We had uncovered a darkness that most people would never see, and it had changed us in ways we could never fully comprehend. As we drove away from the subdivision, we vowed never to forget the horrors we had witnessed, and to always be vigilant against the darkness that lurked in the world around us. Moving into our fixer-upper was a dream come true. My partner and I had big plans to turn the rundown house into our perfect home. We were excited to roll up our sleeves and get to work, but little did we know the nightmare that awaited us. The first sign that something was amiss came when we started receiving strange letters in the mail. They were handwritten, scrawled in messy script, and addressed to the previous owners of the house. At first, we brushed it off as junk mail, but the letters kept coming, each one more urgent and demanding than the last. Then, one day, as we were painting the walls in the living room, we heard a knock on the door. When we answered, we were greeted by a man claiming to be the previous owner of the house. He was unkempt, with wild eyes and a manic grin that sent shivers down my spine. He introduced himself as Mr. Thompson and said he had sold the house to us under duress. He claimed that he had been forced to sell the house to pay off debts, and now he wanted it back. For free. We tried to reason with him, to explain that we had legally purchased the house and had no intention of giving it back. But he wouldn't listen. He just stood there, his eyes boring into ours, as if trying to force us to comply with his demands. As the days passed, Mr. Thompson's visits became more frequent and more aggressive. He would bang on our door at all hours of the day and night, demanding that we give him back his house. He would peer in through the windows, watching our every move with a look of intense hatred in his eyes. We tried to ignore him, to carry on with our renovations as if nothing was wrong. But his presence was a constant shadow hanging over us, a reminder that our dream home was built on shaky ground. Then, one night, things took a sinister turn. We were awakened by the sound of someone moving around downstairs. We crept out of bed, our hearts pounding in our chests, and tiptoed down the stairs to investigate. That's when we saw him, Mr. Thompson, standing in the middle of our living room, a crazed look in his eyes. He was holding a hammer, his knuckles white with tension as he glared at us with undisguised hatred. We froze, unsure of what to do. But before we could react, he lunged at us, swinging the hammer wildly in our direction. We barely managed to dodge out of the way, scrambling to safety as he chased us through the house. We managed to escape out the back door, but the terror of that night stayed with us long after Mr. Thompson had disappeared into the darkness. We knew then that we had to do something, that we couldn't continue living in fear of what he might do next. We went to the police, hoping they could help us get a restraining order against Mr. Thompson. But when we told them our story, they just looked at us with skepticism, as if they thought we were making it all up. Feeling defeated, we returned home, unsure of what to do next. We knew we couldn't stay in the house with Mr. Thompson lurking nearby, but we also couldn't afford to walk away from our investment. In the end, we decided to hire a lawyer and take legal action against Mr. Thompson. It was a long and arduous process, but eventually, we were able to get a restraining order against him, forcing him to stay away from our property. With Mr. Thompson out of the picture, we were finally able to finish our renovations and turn the house into the home we had always dreamed of. Moving into the grand Victorian mansion was like stepping into a fairy tale. My husband and I had inherited the house from a distant relative, and we were thrilled at the opportunity to start our married life in such a majestic home. But little did we know that our dream home would soon turn into a nightmare. The first time we met the groundskeeper, Mr. Davis, he seemed like a friendly enough man. He greeted us warmly, showing us around the sprawling estate and regaling us with stories of its rich history. But as the weeks went by, his behavior grew increasingly strange. He would lurk in the shadows, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He would mutter to himself under his breath, his words incomprehensible but filled with a sense of menace that sent shivers down my spine. At first, we tried to ignore his odd behavior, chalking it up to the quirks of an eccentric old man. But as time went on, his actions became more and more unsettling. He would appear out of nowhere, his eyes darting around as if he was searching for something or someone. He would follow us as we explored the grounds, his footsteps echoing ominously in the empty corridors of the mansion. Then, one night, things took a turn for the worse. We were awoken by the sound of someone moving around downstairs. My husband grabbed a flashlight, and we crept downstairs to investigate. That's when we saw him, Mr. Davis, standing in the foyer, his eyes wide with madness. He was muttering to himself, his words barely coherent as he rocked back and forth on his heels. We tried to speak to him, to ask him what was wrong, but he just stared at us with a vacant expression, as if he didn't even recognize us. It was like he was a completely different person, someone or something possessed by a dark and malevolent force. Terrified, we retreated to our room and locked the door, hoping that Mr. Davis would eventually leave us alone. But his presence hung over the house like a dark cloud, casting a pall of fear and uncertainty over everything we did. As the days passed, we felt like prisoners in our own home, trapped by the madness that seemed to have taken hold of Mr. Davis. We tried to reach out to the authorities for help, but they dismissed our concerns, telling us that there was nothing they could do unless he posed a direct threat to our safety. Feeling helpless, we decided to take matters into our own hands. We started researching the history of the mansion, hoping to uncover some clue as to what was happening. What we found was chilling. It turned out that Mr. Davis had been the groundskeeper for generations, his family serving the owners of the mansion for centuries. But there were rumors of dark deeds and unspeakable horrors that had taken place within its walls, rumors that hinted at something far more sinister than we could have ever imagined. Armed with this knowledge, we confronted Mr. Davis, demanding to know the truth. But he just laughed, a hollow, mocking sound that sent shivers down our spines. That's when we knew we had to get out. We couldn't stay in the mansion any longer, not with Mr. Davis lurking in the shadows, his sanity slipping away with each passing day. We put the mansion up for sale, desperate to escape its haunted halls and the madness that had consumed Mr. Davis. And when the day finally came to leave, we felt a sense of relief wash over us, a weight lifted from our shoulders as we drove away from the mansion for the last time. Moving into my sleek high-rise condo was a dream come true. The city buzzed with life outside my window, and I felt like I was finally making it in the world. But as I settled into my new home, I started noticing strange things happening. It all started with the man who lived in the condo above me. He seemed normal enough at first, just another neighbor going about his business. But then I started hearing odd noises coming from his apartment late at night. It sounded like he was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself in a low, urgent voice. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just the sound of a busy city. But the noises grew louder and more frequent, keeping me awake into the early hours of the morning. One night, I mustered up the courage to knock on his door and ask him to keep it down. But when he answered, he just stared at me with vacant eyes, as if he didn't even recognize me. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that something wasn't right about him. But I brushed it off as my imagination running wild and went back to my own apartment, trying to put the encounter out of my mind. But then things started getting even weirder. I would catch glimpses of him standing in the hallway outside my apartment, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Whenever I tried to approach him, he would vanish around a corner, leaving me alone in the empty hallway. I started avoiding him whenever possible, taking the stairs instead of the elevator and hurrying past his door whenever I had to go past his apartment. But no matter how hard I tried to avoid him, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a knock on my door. My heart raced as I approached cautiously, wondering who could be knocking at this hour. When I opened the door, I was met with the sight of the man from the condo above me standing in the hallway, his eyes wild with fear. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his hair disheveled and his clothes rumpled. He begged me to let him in, to protect him from whatever was chasing him. I wanted to help him, to offer him some kind of comfort in his time of need. But something about the desperation in his eyes sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was dangerous. I told him I couldn't help him, that he needed to leave before he attracted attention to my apartment. But as I closed the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a terrible mistake. That night, I lay awake in bed, my mind racing with thoughts of the man in the condo above me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, that he was hiding something sinister beneath his seemingly normal exterior. The next morning, I decided to do some digging into his background, hoping to uncover some clue as to what was going on. But the more I searched, the less I found. It was like he didn't even exist, like he had just appeared out of thin air. I started to wonder if I was going crazy, if maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then I found something that sent a chill down my spine. Tucked away in a corner of his apartment, hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers, was a collection of photographs. They were grainy and faded with age, but as I looked closer, I realized they were pictures of me. I felt my blood run cold as I realized that the man in the condo above me had been watching me, studying my every move from the shadows. And as I looked into his vacant eyes, I realized that I was in more danger than I had ever imagined. Moving into the historic brownstone was supposed to be my fresh start. After a messy breakup, I was eager to start over in a new city, in a new home. The brownstone seemed perfect, a charming old building with lots of character and history. At first, everything seemed fine. The neighbors were friendly, waving to me as I moved my boxes inside and offering to help with anything I needed. I felt a sense of excitement as I explored my new home, imagining all the memories I would create within its walls. But as the days passed, things started to take a dark turn. I began receiving strange messages on my phone, threats and warnings from an unknown sender. At first, I tried to brush them off as just a prank, but they soon became more and more frequent, more and more sinister. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me like a dark cloud. I started to feel like I was being watched, like someone was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I tried to confide in my neighbors, hoping they could shed some light on what was happening, but they just looked at me with pitying eyes, as if they thought I was imagining things. Feeling alone and scared, I reached out to the police for help. They listened to my story, but without any concrete evidence, there was little they could do. They told me to be vigilant and to report any further threats, but I could tell they didn't take me seriously. As the messages grew more and more threatening, I started to fear for my safety. I couldn't sleep at night, my mind consumed by thoughts of who could be behind the messages and what they wanted from me. I tried to go about my daily life as if nothing was wrong, but the constant fear gnawed at me, eating away at my sanity. I felt like I was living in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Then, one night, things took a terrifying turn. I was awoken by the sound of someone moving around in the apartment above me. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just one of my neighbors, but the footsteps sounded too purposeful, too deliberate. I lay in bed, frozen with fear, as the footsteps grew closer and closer. And then, suddenly, they stopped, leaving me alone in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door, a single word written in elegant script: soon. I knew then that I had to get out, that I couldn't stay in the brownstone any longer. I packed my bags and fled, leaving behind the home that had turned into a prison of fear. After a messy divorce and a stressful job, I was ready for a change of scenery. The townhouse seemed perfect, a grand old building with lots of character and charm. At first, everything seemed fine. The neighbors were friendly, waving to me as I moved my boxes inside and offering to help with anything I needed. I felt a sense of excitement as I explored my new home, imagining all the memories I would create within its walls. But as the days passed, things started to take a dark turn. I began to notice strange things happening around the townhouse, objects misplaced, strange noises in the middle of the night, a feeling of unease that lingered in the air. I tried to brush it off as just the quirks of an old building, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger with each passing day. It was like there was something lurking just beneath the surface, something dark and sinister that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then, one night, as I was working late in my home office, I heard a knock on the door. It was late, well past midnight, and I couldn't imagine who would be calling at that hour. I hesitated before answering, my heart pounding in my chest as I made my way to the door. When I opened it, I was greeted by a sight that sent chills down my spine: a man dressed as a clown, his face painted in garish colors and a sinister grin plastered across his lips. He stared at me with cold, empty eyes, his gaze sending a shiver down my spine. I tried to ask him what he wanted, but he just stood there, silent and unmoving, like a statue. I felt a surge of fear wash over me, a primal instinct telling me that I needed to get away from this man as quickly as possible. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me, my hands trembling with fear. I could hear the sound of the man's footsteps retreating down the hallway, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching and waiting. I tried to tell myself that it was just a prank, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, I knew that something was seriously wrong, that the man dressed as a clown was just the beginning of something far more sinister. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I would catch glimpses of figures lurking in the shadows, their eyes following me as I moved around the townhouse. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew that something was seriously wrong. I tried to confide in my neighbors, hoping they could shed some light on what was happening, but they just shrugged it off and told me not to worry. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the townhouse, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then, one night, as I was working late in my home office, I heard the sound of someone moving around in the hallway outside. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened to the sound of footsteps growing closer and closer. I wanted to call out for help, but fear had rendered me speechless, my voice trapped in my throat. I huddled in my office, praying that whoever was out there would just go away and leave me alone. But the footsteps grew closer and closer, until they were right outside my door. I could hear the sound of someone breathing heavily, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. I closed my eyes and prayed for it to be over, but when I opened them again, the door to my office was swinging open, and the man dressed as a clown was standing in the doorway, his sinister grin wider than ever. I screamed and lunged for the phone, dialing 911 as quickly as I could. I could hear the man laughing as he advanced towards me, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the townhouse. But before he could reach me, the police burst through the door, guns drawn and ready to take down the intruder. The man dressed as a clown tried to run, but they caught him before he could get away, dragging him away in handcuffs as he screamed and thrashed against them. As the adrenaline wore off and the reality of what had just happened sank in, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The nightmare was finally over, and I could finally start to move on with my life. After a failed business venture and a breakup, I was ready to leave the past behind and focus on building something new. The loft seemed perfect, sleek, spacious, with plenty of room for both living and working. At first, everything seemed fine. I spent the first few days unpacking boxes and setting up my office, eager to dive into my latest project. But as I settled into my new home, things started to take a dark turn. It started with the emails. At first, they were just simple messages, innocuous enough on their own. But as time went on, they grew more sinister, filled with threats and insinuations that made my blood run cold. I tried to brush them off as just the work of a troll or a prankster, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The messages seemed too personal, too targeted to be the work of a stranger. I tried to ignore them and focus on my work, but the emails kept coming, each one more chilling than the last. They seemed to know everything about me, where I lived, where I worked, even details about my personal life that I had never shared with anyone. I started to feel paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every little noise. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching my every move and waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to reach out for help, to tell someone about what was happening, but no one believed me. They just dismissed it as the work of a hacker or a spammer, telling me not to worry about it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, that I was in real danger. I started to spend more and more time holed up in my loft, afraid to leave the safety of my home. Then, one night, as I was working late in my office, I had a panic attack. I thought I was having a heart attack, but the medics said it was just a panic attack. Either way, I got out of there, changed my line of work and kept everything as private as possible. Luckily, I have not had anything since. Moving into the suburban ranch was meant to be a fresh start for me, a chance to leave behind the stress of city life and focus on my writing. The wide open spaces and peaceful surroundings seemed like the perfect backdrop for my new life. At first, everything seemed normal. I spent my days working on my latest article and exploring the local area, eager to uncover the stories that lay hidden beneath the surface. But as I delved deeper into the community, I started to uncover evidence of a dark conspiracy lurking just beneath the surface. It started with small things, whispers and rumors among the locals, strange occurrences that seemed to defy explanation. But the more I dug, the more I realized that there was something seriously wrong in this town, something that went far beyond a simple misunderstanding. I tried to reach out to my colleagues and share what I had discovered, but no one would listen. They dismissed my claims as the work of an overactive imagination, telling me to focus on more important things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was onto something, that there was a story here worth telling. So, I pressed on, determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost. As I delved deeper into the conspiracy, the threats against me grew more frequent and more intense. I started receiving threatening messages and anonymous phone calls, warning me to back off before it was too late. But I refused to be intimidated. I had come too far to turn back now, and I was determined to see this through to the end. Then, one night, as I was working late in my home office, I heard a knock on the door. It was late, well past midnight, and I couldn't imagine who would be calling at that hour. My heart pounding in my chest, I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. Standing on my doorstep was a man dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a shadowy hood. He had an air of menace about him, and I could feel my blood run cold as I realized that he was the one behind the threats. But instead of running, I stood my ground. I refused to be intimidated by this shadowy figure, and I made it clear that I wouldn't back down until I had uncovered the truth. With a menacing glare, the man turned and disappeared into the night, leaving me shaken but more determined than ever to see this through to the end. In the days that followed, I worked tirelessly to gather evidence and expose the conspiracy once and for all. And finally, after weeks of relentless investigation, I had enough to blow the case wide open. I published my article, revealing the truth behind the dark conspiracy that had plagued the town for so long. And as the story spread, the perpetrators were brought to justice, and the community was finally able to heal. Though I had faced countless threats and dangers along the way, I emerged from the experience stronger and more determined than ever to seek out the truth and hold those responsible accountable for their actions. And as I packed up my things and prepared to leave the suburban ranch behind, I knew that I had made a difference, that my work had helped to shine a light on the darkness and bring about real change. Settling into the smart home was meant to mark a new beginning, a fresh start after the struggles of building my tech startup from the ground up. The sleek, modern design and state-of-the-art automation had drawn me in, promising convenience and comfort. But as I began to test out the home's features, I noticed something unsettling: glitches and malfunctions that seemed to suggest someone else was controlling the house remotely. At first, it was small things: lights flickering on and off, the thermostat fluctuating wildly, doors opening and closing on their own. I tried to brush it off as just the quirks of a new system, but the feeling of unease lingered. As the glitches persisted, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was monitoring my every move from afar. I started to question whether I was truly alone in the house, whether there was someone else lurking in the shadows, manipulating the smart devices to their own sinister ends. I tried to investigate, to uncover any evidence of unauthorized access to the home's systems, but everything seemed to check out. There was no sign of a breach, no indication that anyone else had been tampering with the controls. But the glitches continued, growing more frequent and more unsettling with each passing day. I started to feel like a prisoner in my own home, constantly on edge and unable to relax for fear of what might happen next. Then, one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a voice coming from the smart speaker in the living room. It was faint at first, just a whisper in the darkness, but it sent a chill down my spine. I crept out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the living room. And that's when I saw it, the smart speaker's light blinking on and off, its voice echoing through the empty room with a cold, mechanical tone. I tried to disconnect the speaker, to shut it down and put an end to the intrusion, but no matter what I did, the voice continued to speak, taunting me with cryptic messages and threats. I felt a surge of panic rising within me as I realized that I was now alone in the house, that someone else was controlling the smart devices and using them to torment me. But who could it be? And why were they targeting me? I racked my brain for answers, trying to think of anyone who might have a motive to harm me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come up with any suspects. It was like the house itself was conspiring against me, its automated features turning against their owner in a bid to drive me mad. As the days went by, the situation only grew worse. The glitches became more frequent, the voice more insistent, until I felt like I was teetering on the edge of sanity. I knew then that I had to get out, to escape the smart home and the nightmare it had become. But every time I tried to leave, I found myself trapped, the doors locking shut and the windows refusing to budge. I felt like a rat in a maze, trapped in a web of technology that was slowly closing in around me. I knew that if I didn't find a way out soon, I would be consumed by the darkness that lurked within the smart home's walls. With a surge of determination, I made one last desperate attempt to escape. I smashed through the front door, ignoring the pain as shards of glass tore into my flesh, and ran into the night, away from the smart home and the horrors it contained. As I stumbled through the darkness, gasping for breath and praying for salvation, I knew that I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. Moving into the new house was supposed to mark a fresh start for me. After leaving behind my life as a private investigator, I was eager to settle into a quiet neighborhood and leave the chaos of my past behind. The house seemed perfect, cozy, with a spacious backyard and friendly neighbors. But as I started to unpack my boxes and settle into my new home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with my neighbor, Mr. Johnson. He seemed like a friendly enough guy at first, always offering a wave and a smile whenever we crossed paths. But the more I observed him, the more I started to notice strange behavior. He would come and go at odd hours of the night, his movements furtive and secretive. And whenever I tried to strike up a conversation, he would quickly change the subject or make some excuse to end the interaction. I tried to brush it off as just the quirks of a new neighbor, but the feeling of unease lingered. There was something about Mr. Johnson that didn't sit right with me, something that made my skin crawl whenever he was around. Then, one night, I heard strange noises coming from his house. It was late, well past midnight, and I couldn't imagine why anyone would be up and about at that hour. I debated whether to investigate, but something held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something sinister happening on the other side of the wall, something that I wasn't meant to see. As the days passed, the strange occurrences only grew more frequent. I would catch glimpses of Mr. Johnson through his windows, his face twisted in a mask of fear and paranoia. And whenever I tried to confront him about it, he would just brush me off and tell me not to worry. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that Mr. Johnson was hiding something dark and sinister behind closed doors. I tried to focus on settling into my new life, but the feeling of unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind like a persistent itch. Then, one day, I received a package in the mail addressed to Mr. Johnson. It was a small, nondescript box, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. I debated whether to open it and see what was inside, but something told me that it was better left untouched. Instead, I decided to do some digging into Mr. Johnson's background, hoping to uncover some clue as to what was going on. But the more I searched, the less I found. It was like he was a ghost, with no online presence or paper trail to speak of. I tried to reach out to other neighbors to see if they had noticed anything strange about Mr. Johnson, but they all just shrugged it off and told me not to worry. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was onto something, that there was more to Mr. Johnson than met the eye. Then, one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a knock on the door. It was late, well past midnight, and I couldn't imagine who would be calling at that hour. I debated whether to answer it, but something told me that it was better left unanswered. As I lay there in the darkness, the knocking grew louder and more insistent, echoing through the empty house like a drumbeat of doom. I felt a surge of fear rising within me, but I forced myself to stay calm, to wait and see what would happen next. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for the sound to return. But it never did. I knew then that I had to leave, to get as far away from Mr. Johnson and his dark secrets as possible. So, I packed up my things and left the house behind, never looking back. But even now, years later, the memory of Mr. Johnson and his strange behavior still haunts me. I may never know what he was up to, but one thing's for certain, I'll never forget the terror I felt living next door to him. The town seemed quiet and peaceful, with friendly neighbors and a sense of community that I had been longing for. But as I settled into my new home, I started to notice things that didn't quite add up. It started with little things, whispers and glances exchanged between the townsfolk when they thought I wasn't looking. At first, I tried to brush it off as just the quirks of a small town, but the feeling of unease lingered. Then, one day, I overheard a conversation at the local diner that sent chills down my spine. The townspeople were talking about a crime that had been committed years ago, something dark and sinister that had been swept under the rug and forgotten. I tried to ask around, to see if anyone would tell me more about what had happened, but everyone just clammed up and refused to talk. It was like they were afraid of something, like they were hiding a terrible secret that they didn't want anyone to uncover. I tried to put it out of my mind and focus on settling into my new life, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger with each passing day. It was like there was something lurking just beneath the surface, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then, one night, I heard noises coming from the house next door. It was late, well past midnight, and I couldn't imagine why anyone would be up and about at that hour. I debated whether to investigate, but something held me back. It was like a voice in the back of my mind warning me to stay away, to mind my own business and not get involved. But the curiosity got the better of me, and I crept over to the window to see if I could catch a glimpse of what was happening. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were people gathered in the backyard, their faces obscured by the darkness. They were digging a hole, their movements frantic and desperate. I wanted to scream, to call the police and tell them what I had seen, but something held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that involving the authorities would only make things worse, that they were somehow involved in whatever was happening. I watched in horror as the people in the backyard buried something in the ground before covering it up and returning to their houses. I knew then that I had stumbled upon something that I wasn't meant to see, something that could get me killed if I wasn't careful. I tried to pretend like I hadn't seen anything, to go about my life as if everything was normal. But the memory of what I had witnessed haunted me, lurking in the back of my mind like a shadow waiting to pounce. And then, one day, I received a visit from the police. They asked me if I had seen anything suspicious lately, if I had noticed anything out of the ordinary. I wanted to tell them about what I had seen in the backyard next door, but something held me back. It was like a voice in the back of my mind warning me to keep my mouth shut, to protect myself at all costs. I lied to the police, telling them that I hadn't seen anything unusual lately. They seemed satisfied with my answer and left without another word, but I knew that I had made a terrible mistake. I had let fear and paranoia cloud my judgment, and now I was in deeper than ever. I knew then that I had to get out of that town, to leave behind the secrets and lies that threatened to consume me. So, I packed up my things and left in the dead of night, never looking back.